Hello, all my relations. Welcome to another program, Eagle and Condor. This is Tony Gonzalez, your host today, Sunday, July 13, 2025. And today I'll be presenting to you a continuation of videos, in this case of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that was just held April the 21st through May the 2nd. And the program, we've been doing a series of these videos during the course of those 2 weeks. And last week you heard session number 4. And this is today session number 5 of the Permanent Forum, April the 22nd. So I hope you tune in. During the course of the video, you'll hear the chairman occasionally talk to the general audience, Indigenous peoples in particular, about, clapping after a speaker talks or the room getting too loud. So she'll come with some protocol and also the decorum and maintenance in the settings such as this international fora, in keeping with effort to find solutions instead of arguing or coming out with bad words about each other. You'll hear that occasionally, where governments will indeed respond to an NGO talking about the settlers in their countries and what they themselves are being subjected to. So listen in on that. Also, there will be a report on the social determinants of health, my relatives, which I hope you find very interesting. There'll be a speaker there from the country of Latvia who will declare themselves, who have declared themselves more recently as the European indigenous peoples of that territory. So it's be interesting to listen to this representative. Although there are also Sami people of Scandinavia who are European and indigenous people. So Latvia, welcome to the arena, defending ourselves. And also his speech was too long, he got cut off. So limit for each speaker, as you well know if you've been following along, it's 3 minutes or cutoff time. One in particular is Chief Gary Harrison that will be speaking, and he's a representative of Chickaloon Village. He's Athabascan up in Alaska, and he'll be talking about food sovereignty, but he'll also make a statement against governments taking up too much time in this UN Permanent Forum arena. So listen in on it. And finally, my relatives, don't forget this July 17, the Good Trouble Lives On march happening in cities all across the country in honor of Congressman John Lewis, who passed on back, about 5 years ago, July of 2020, I believe. But this is a good march and rally to attend because his legacy lives on, and with your presence. So that's Good Trouble Lives On, and you can go to goodtroublesliveon.org, O-R-G, that is, for more information. All right, my relatives, you have a good rest of July, and we'll be coming again to you next Sunday. Tell your friends, and be sure to listen to public radio like Public TV. Public radio here in the San Francisco Bay Area would be KPOO, that's 89.5 in San Francisco. Listen to KPFA in Berkeley, that's 94.1 FM. All right, my relatives, also website for AIM West, go to www.aim-west.org for the radio shows and TV shows that I also archive at that website. All right, my relatives, let's go into that video, session number 5 at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Distinguished members of the forum, distinguished observers, before we take up the item on our agenda for this afternoon, I would like to address a serious concern I have received from a member state informing me that prior to the opening of our first meeting in the GA hall yesterday, some people in the room displayed printed political material against its national sovereignty. This is not acceptable, and I want to make it clear that the venue and space of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues must not be used for extraneous political ends. I therefore request all participants to respect the mandate and work of the forum and to therefore desist from displaying or distributing any printed materials in the room without the express consent of the Secretariat and the forum. All participants are reminded once more to follow the established guidelines as directed by the conference officers. In particular, participants must ensure that they sit only on the seat that bears their country name or that is designated for them. Participants sitting on a seat that is not designated for them would immediately be removed. I thank you in advance for your cooperation. In accordance with our program of work, this afternoon, the forum will continue and conclude its consideration of item 3, discussion on the theme implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within United Nations member states and the United Nations system, including identifying good practices and addressing challenges. On this item, the forum has before it a related study entitled Evaluating Institutional Structures to Improve the Health and Wellness of Indigenous Peoples Globally, the Indigenous Determinants of Health Measurement Instrument, contained in document E/C.19/2025/5. Before I give the floor to my esteemed colleague, Jeffrey Roth, I'm going to give the floor to Ali Hadjalari.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Esteemed colleagues, I intended to raise this point in the previous session, but since the 5-minute break was announced, I bring it now up. I stand before you today as a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, compelled to address a pressing issue that undermines our work. The persistent delays in visa processing by the host country are not only an inconvenience, but a blatant violation of its commitments under the United Nations Headquarters Agreement. These delays prevent us from fulfilling our mandates, and the continued disruption diminishes the forum's credibility. This is not a matter of privilege, but it is our fundamental right under the ECOSOC authority to participate in these discussions. When even a single member is delayed or denied entry, we lose critical perspective and the integrity of our work is compromised. I have personally faced this challenge. In my first year, a delayed visa cost me the first week of the session. And this year I was forced to miss the preparatory meeting on April 17. Some have suggested relocating the forum, but this would be nothing more than a temporary fix. It would merely erase the problem rather than addressing it, effectively giving up on finding a solution. The issue would simply persist in another form. What we need is accountability from the host country. We must demand a binding guarantee that visas for all members and invited Indigenous representatives are issued at least 15 days prior to each meeting, ensuring that our right to participate is upheld without delay or discrimination. It is time to hold the host country to its obligation and ensure that the voices of Indigenous peoples are never again silenced due to bureaucratic failures. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your statement. I'm now going to go over and give the floor to esteemed forum member Jeffrey Roth to present his report. You have the floor.
Madam Chair, distinguished delegates, Indigenous brothers and sisters, it's my honor today to present to this forum on behalf of myself and the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, our study, which is titled Evaluating International Structures Through the Indigenous Determinants of Health Measurement Instrument, Compliance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Cultural Safety. We see this as a best practice for the UN system and member states to monitor their implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This work emerges from our collective recognition of indigeneity as a fundamental determinant of health, directly influencing the well-being of Indigenous peoples globally. Our study introduces a groundbreaking measurement instrument designed explicitly to assess the extent to which institutional structures comply with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and embody the principles of cultural safety. This measurement instrument is deeply rooted in two preceding reports, which form its foundational pillars. The first foundational report, Indigenous Determinants of Health in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2023, clearly identified that Indigenous peoples approach health holistically as an equilibrium encompassing spirituality, traditional medicine, biodiversity, and the interconnectedness of all that exists. It underscored that Indigenous determinants of health must be addressed distinctly and separately from a general minority approach. The report recognized 33 interrelated determinants that are grouped into three categories: intergenerational holistic healing, the health of Mother Earth, and decolonizing and re-indigenizing culture. It stressed the urgency of shifting from a Western-centric health paradigm towards one that is inclusive of Indigenous worldviews and experiences. The second foundational report, Improving the Health and Wellness of Indigenous Peoples Globally, Operationalization of the Indigenous Determinants of Health in 2024, advanced these ideas further by providing actionable framework for United Nations entities and member states. It called for recognizing indigeneity itself as an overarching determinant of health and emphasized the necessity of Indigenous leadership in health research, policymaking, and operational practices. This report also strongly advocated for Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, data sovereignty, and meaningful representation within institutional structures. Crucially, it urged entities to establish mechanisms ensuring compliance with principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Building upon these pivotal reports, our current study introduces a comprehensive evaluative tool aimed at transforming commitments into measurable actions. It allows Indigenous leaders, policymakers, and global institutions to clearly gauge their compliance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and evaluate their culturally safety practices. To conclude, we respectfully call upon my colleagues on the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to recommend that UN agencies and mechanisms adopt this instrument internally to evaluate and improve their compliance with the Indigenous Determinants of Health and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Furthermore, we extend a sincere invitation and call to Indigenous leaders worldwide to partner with the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance. Together, we can evaluate and validate Indigenous serving institutions, agencies, and entities globally, ensuring genuine accountability and transformative progress. I'd like to thank the 35 Indigenous advocates, researchers, and leaders that make up the Indigenous Determinants of Health from all 7 sociocultural regions, and especially thank Dr. Allison Kelleher from Snow Creek Medicines and Dr. Jamie Barges from One Fire Associates for their expert assistance in evaluation methodology and for helping to make sure this study was a reality. Please join the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, the National Indian Health Board, the World Federation of Public Health Associations, the Aramat Project, the Coquille Tribe of Oregon, and the Ban Ki-moon Foundation to celebrate and discuss this evaluation tool Thursday from 4:30 to 5:30 in Conference Room 5. There are individuals in the back with flyers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank Mr. Roth for introducing that study. Thank you. We shall now hear from the remaining speakers on the list of speakers for this item. Moving forward with the rotation of statements, the representatives of Indigenous peoples organizations are reminded to raise their hand once given the floor so that their microphone can be activated. All speakers should kindly be guided by the time limit of 3 minutes for statements and are requested to speak at a reasonable speed to facilitate accurate interpretation. Observers delivering statements are requested to send a copy of their statement to estatements@un.org before their intervention. Please ensure the name of the meeting, the speaker's name, and the agenda item are clearly indicated in both the subject line of the email and the heading of the statement. This will help ensure accurate interpretation and proper documentation. I now give the floor to my esteemed colleague, Permanent Forum Member Keith Harper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This year's theme, Implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within United Nations member states and United Nations systems, including identifying good practices and addressing challenges, is a call to return to first principles. What is the purpose of the forum? It is our duty to host this gathering and provide a space for Indigenous peoples from throughout the globe to advise of their experiences, including how their rights are being impacted by member states and other non-governmental actors. But that is not the forum's central purpose. This forum's purpose is to address rights challenges. Our purpose is to advance Indigenous peoples' rights. The metrics to measure our success, therefore, have we been an instrument to advance human rights and successfully press for the adoption of best practices. And for this purpose, we need to not guess what all the rights are to promote in advance. These rights have been supported universally by member states in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's a persuasive argument that given this universal adoption, the rights enshrined in the Declaration are by and large customary international law and binding on all member states, not unlike the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let me underline this last point. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, as the name implies, a declaration. Indeed, the UDHR today, though, is considered part of the trilogy that we call the International Bill of Human Rights, along with the ICCPR and the ICESC and their optional protocols. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should properly be considered, given its universal support, in this same vein. Simply put, member states have an obligation to take affirmative steps to fully implement the Declaration's prescriptions. This includes, of course, free, prior, and informed consent whenever Indigenous communities' lands and territories are impacted by domestic or international policies or laws. We need to have an honest, non-confrontational, apolitical conversation about where the Declaration's principles are followed and where they are not. As we look around the world, the record is mixed. There have been some positive developments. There are examples where Indigenous people have been included as core players in decision-making structures regarding their lands and resources. Certain states have agreed to develop action plans in consultation with Indigenous peoples to adopt specific mechanisms to fulfill domestic law and policy with the Declaration's dictates. There are broader use of Indigenous tribunals to make decisions about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous children in particular. Some specifics. In Brazil, the government recently established an Indigenous Affairs Minister, and indeed, that has led to the set-aside of 13 separate land bases under state protection for various indigenous peoples. Here in the United States, just this year, the administration affirmed its commitment to the Declaration and outlined several measures to achieve free, prior, and informed consent frameworks in appropriate decision-making. Canada has undergone a reconciliation process that has set a greater foundation for honest dialogue and redress. It is important to publicly acknowledge where advancements have occurred. At the same time, we must also note that too often the Declaration has been honored in its breach. Too often states have not imbued their laws and policies to conform with the Declaration's terms. As a result, we see the violation of indigenous peoples' rights far too often. Here in the United States, there is a gold mine developed in Arizona that will almost assuredly greatly disturb, if not destroy, land sacred to certain Apache bands. They had not given their free, prior, and informed consent. Canada, the United States, continues to pursue Line 5 despite a threat to the waterways, the fishing grounds, and the fisheries central to numerous tribes in that area. Again, no free, prior, and informed consent. The Russian aggression in Ukraine has targeted Crimea and undermined the rights of indigenous Crimean Tatars communities, including their autonomy and territorial integrity. In the Congo, certain rebel groups are displacing indigenous peoples in eastern Congo, vitiating their rights to both autonomy and territorial integrity. The Uyghur people meet all the requisites of an indigenous peoples. They are an indigenous peoples. Accordingly, the Declaration applies to them. Yet the Uyghurs are sent to camps where they are denied the basic rights to practice their culture and where they are indoctrinated. At the same time, the central government has undermined their rights to their lands and territories as well as their right to autonomy. Critical minerals have emerged as a necessity of the move towards a greening economy and the developments in the information age. But far too often, these critical minerals are mined in a manner that wholly ignores the rights of indigenous peoples and the Declaration's strict dictates on the use of indigenous lands, resources, and territories. There is presently in the news discussion of Greenland, but we all must bear in mind that Greenland is essentially an indigenous nation, along with the rights of the Greenlanders under Danish law. The Declaration plainly applies as well, and therefore Greenlanders must be central to charting their own future and directing their own destiny. The Declaration provides as much. Whatever happens, their rights of autonomy and territorial integrity must be sacrosanct, and all member states must keep this front of mind. The Declaration is mere words on paper if we let it be that. But the Forum is supposed to ensure that over time we advance these rights and make those words alive with purpose and meaning. That is our charge, and I call on the Special Rapporteur, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, and my fellow Forum members now and in the future to continue to offer member states guidance as to how to realize the words where the Declaration is in the guiding light of law and policy. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank my colleague, Mr. Keith Harper, for his statement. I now call upon the representative of Guyana.
Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I am honored to speak on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. We welcome this year's focus on the practical implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and reaffirm CARICOM's commitment to advancing its principles, ensuring that the rights of indigenous peoples are fully respected, protected, and realized across our region. Indigenous peoples are a foundational part of our region's identity and history. Their spiritual and ecological connection to the land and sea continues to shape who we are today. Their knowledge and leadership offer perspectives and solutions that are essential to advancing our sustainable development and building climate resilience. CARICOM member states continue to advance efforts that uphold and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples. These include initiatives to support cultural revitalization, create dedicated ministries or departments focused on Indigenous affairs, improve access to essential services such as education and health care, and integrate traditional knowledge into environmental and disaster planning. Meaningful engagement with Indigenous community is central to CARICOM's approach. Our member states continue to strengthen inclusive platforms for dialogue that enable Indigenous peoples to actively contribute to policy formation, including on climate action and biodiversity protection. However, there is still work to be done. We continue to work on building institutional capacity, collecting disaggregated data, and ensuring that policies are fully inclusive and effective on the ground. As we address these challenges, CARICOM emphasizes the importance of enhanced collaboration between governments, Indigenous peoples, and international partners. Equally important is ensuring that climate resilience and adaptation are designed in collaboration with Indigenous peoples and reflect their experiences, knowledge, and priorities. CARICOM called for greater technical cooperation and targeted funding for Indigenous-led initiatives, especially those that protect culture, promote sustainable development, and build community resilience. Indigenous peoples must also have direct access to climate funds. We also call for increased international cooperation for capacity building programs that support member states in the implementation of UNDRIP. In closing, CARICOM believes that the successful implementation of the UNDRIP must be rooted in genuine partnership and respect for Indigenous peoples. We stand ready to work collaboratively with the international community to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana on behalf of CARICOM. I call now upon the representative of the World Intellectual Property Organization.
Madam Chairperson, honorable members of the forum, distinguished delegates, representatives of indigenous organizations, it's my honor to speak on behalf of the Secretariat of the World Intellectual Property Organization. My name is Adam Kyomohendo. I am a proud member of the Busangura Indigenous People of Uganda and the WIPO Indigenous Fellow. On May 24, 2024, after years of negotiations, WIPO member states, at the conclusion of a diplomatic conference, consensually adopted a WIPO Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources, and Associated Traditional Knowledge. To summarize, this treaty aims to enhance the efficacy, transparency, and quality of the patent system by establishing inter alia a mandatory patent disclosure requirement that requires patent applicants to disclose the indigenous peoples providing the traditional knowledge and that is associated with genetic resources if they claim the inventions are based on such associated traditional knowledge. The treaty will come into force 3 months after 15 eligible parties have ratified or acceded the treaty. This treaty marks an historic milestone as the first WIPO treaty that addresses traditional knowledge and includes provisions specifically for indigenous peoples. The treaty acknowledges the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. WIPO wishes to pay tribute to the representatives of indigenous peoples who participated in the negotiation of the treaty. Funding of 11 representatives of the indigenous peoples to participate in the diplomatic conference was ensured through the budget allocated to the diplomatic conference and the WIPO Voluntary Fund. In December last year and March this year, negotiations resumed at WIPO with the objective of finalizing an agreement on an international legal instrument or instruments relating to the intellectual property protection of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. In parallel, WIPO has been expanding its support to indigenous peoples to enable them to make optimal use of existing intellectual property tools like trademarks and collective marks. We are very pleased to inform that the WIPO Community Entrepreneurship Program continues to provide additional support to selected beneficiaries, which is key for the consolidation and further development of their tradition-based businesses. A call for applications addressed to indigenous women entrepreneurs from Mexico, Central America, and Dominican Republic will be published shortly. More details and indigenous perspectives about the WIPO Treaty and WIPO activities were provided at WIPO's side event, which took place earlier today. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of WIPO. I now call upon the representative of Prahar, AIPP.
Kurumjari, Madam Chair. The world remains largely unaware of Manipur's sufferings over the past 2 years because our government has actively pushed our crisis under a rug away from the eyes of the world. But today, Madam Chair, I ask you to see us, to hear us, to act us. This is not just for Manipur, this is about defending the human rights and dignity of indigenous people everywhere. I stand before you with profound grief, representing the native Manipur indigenous people of Manipur, northeastern Indian state bordering Myanmar. Manipur, once an independent princely state with a constitutional monarchy, was merged with Indian Union in 1947 under the agreement guaranteeing territorial integrity. Today, that integrity has been compromised. Manipur is the land of rich cultural heritage, the birthplace of modern polo, locally known as Sagol Kangjai, yet is now a region of scarred by violence. For 2 years, Manipur has faced a severe humanitarian and indigenous crisis. Over 200 killed, 4,700 homes burned, and 60,000 indigenous people displaced, living in hampered refugee camps with scarce food, water, and healthcare. Women and children endure rape, beheading, and mutilations. Trauma has spiked, suicides, depending the tragedy. The crisis stems from the Indian government's failure to protect its citizens. Decades of unchecked migrations through Manipur porous 398-kilometer Myanmar border have allowed illegal immigrant narco-terrorists to infiltrate as refugees, illegally obtain citizenship, and disrupt demographic balance, pursuing an ethnocentric homeland and pre-planned strategy to integrate their inhabited area across India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh under ethno-political entrepreneurs aiming to establish a separate nations. The conflict, often mischaracterized as an inter-community dispute, in truth it's a constitutional crisis, a failure to uphold citizenship laws, governance, and the protection of fundamental rights enshrined in India's own constitution. It has evolved into a regional security threat with political global implications, filling illicit arms smuggling, transnational narcotics trade, and geopolitically motivated destabilizations. Today, Manipur is under presidential rules and admissions that states no longer being upheld. Madam Chair, while our people are being slaughtered and displaced, our Prime Minister remains shockingly silent despite numerous domestic and international trips. Since May 2023, he has neither visited Manipur nor addressed the crisis or called for peace. Today, we are confined to just 8% of Manipur's land, surrounded by armed militants, altering demographics and threatening our survival. Is this democracy? Global silence not only abandoned the Meiteis, but only endangered indigenous struggles worldwide. Manipur suffers can no longer be ignored. I urge the Madam Chair, UN entity, member states to mediate our Indian governments to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People strictly and to ensure the safe return of displaced indigenous people and considering scheduled tribe status for Meitei if constitutional criteria are made to secure our future. Justice delay is justice denied. The world must act now. I thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the representative of Pranghar, and I just reiterate, be aware of your pace. It undermines your message if no one can understand, and if the interpreters are not able to keep up and provide an accurate interpretation. I recognize 3 minutes is short, but focus on your main message. I now ask the representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honour indeed to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The EU is a long-standing supporter of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and has contributed to its implementation through its human rights policies, development policy, and financing instruments. To this end, the EU provides support to the Indigenous Peoples Centre for Documentation, Research and Information, supporting efforts to enhance the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples representatives and institutions in relevant UN bodies on issues affecting them. The EU also supports the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs in Denmark, including in implementation of the project Indigenous Navigator, which, as we have heard this morning, is to support and empower Indigenous peoples organizations in generating and using data as a tool for effective self-determined development. The common point of this support is the empowerment of people to have their voices heard effectively, in line with Article 18 of the Declaration, which affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights. It is important to continue developing solutions that fit the needs of Indigenous peoples. This is why the EU continues to engage actively in all relevant forums where the rights of Indigenous peoples are discussed. Unfortunately, we also know that some seek to silence Indigenous peoples. We see a disturbing trend whereby Indigenous peoples, and in particular Indigenous human rights defenders, face threats, intimidation and violence, including when they participate in UN meetings. It is a sad reflection of this trend that for the past 2 years, OHCHR has felt compelled to include a heading on the forum website urging Indigenous peoples to report on threats, human rights abuses and reprisals for participating here. The EU calls out and condemns in the strongest terms cases of murder, harassment, reprisals, land grabbing, arbitrary forced evictions, and other abusive practices. The EU will continue to promote the important role of environmental and Indigenous human rights defenders and to support measures protecting them to help ensure that they are able to live and work in peace and without fear. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the European Union. I now call upon the representative of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Excellencies, distinguished representatives of Indigenous peoples, colleagues and friends, the participation of Indigenous peoples in the UN system has consistently been a priority for the Office of the High Commissioner. We have recently made significant inroads regarding their participation in the work of the Human Rights Council, following decades of sustained advocacy. I would like to provide you with an update on the latest developments and some good practices. The Council has decided to accredit Indigenous peoples to participate in the annual interactive dialogues with the expert mechanism and with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Following a series of informal meetings since 2019, the Council held 2 intersessional meetings last year, co-facilitated by Australia, Canada, and Binota Damai. These meetings brought together Indigenous peoples, states, and other stakeholders. For the first time, Indigenous peoples were accredited to participate in a formal meeting of the Human Rights Council in their own right, not as NGOs. There will be a report about these meetings, but pending the publication of the report, which will happen in June, I would like to share the following recommendations from the co-facilitators. Number 1, to establish a new separate accreditation status for Indigenous peoples, allowing them to participate in the work of the Human Rights Council in their own right. Number 2, to root the accreditation process in the declaration, informed by principles of self-determination, self-identification, equality, non-discrimination, and accountability. Number 3, to create a new independent accreditation mechanism to determine the eligibility of Indigenous peoples. Number 4, to ensure Indigenous peoples can participate under their new status in venues of the Council addressing issues affecting them, with arrangements equivalent to those granted to national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. Number 5, to take measures to ensure Indigenous peoples can freely, safely, and fully participate in the Council's work without limitation or obstacles, addressing any intimidation or reprisals in a timely manner. And number 6, to ensure sufficient resources are available to implement all necessary measures for the enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the Council's work, notably by continuing to support the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. It will now be up to the Council and its member states to take this process forward. Let me end by underlining that enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples is not only a moral imperative, but an investment in our shared future and that of the organization. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I now call upon the representative from Pueblo Originario Quichua de Sarayaco.
Gracias.
Thank you, Chair. Maribel Sante is my name, Chair of the Disaraco people in the southern Amazonian region. 13 years have gone by since the International Inter-American Court ruled in our favor, recognizing that the state of Ecuador violated our collective territory by carrying out extractive activities in our territory without free, prior and informed consent. Since then, Ecuador has continued to not comply with the orders of the court, including restoring land and providing for free informed consent. In 2023, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador, in December of that year, confirmed this non-compliance and called for a new set of measures, including an investigation with regard to the causes for the delay and identifying who was responsible. However, to date, none of this has taken place. Our land continues to be polluted, preventing us from carrying out our sustainable activities. This is leading to prolonged injustice that is endangering our lives, our territory, our culture, and it also reflects a lack of political will that's very worrying in terms of respecting the collective rights of indigenous peoples. Rather than making progress, the state has put obstacles in our way through a public order in 2024, which flies in the face of international standards for free, prior, informed consent, and is stopping our participation in these decisions. Therefore, Chair, we call upon the Permanent Forum to recommend to the State of Ecuador to urgently comply with the Inter-American Human Rights Court and its rulings for our peoples, as well as to urgently adopt a national law on prior informed consent established with the true participation of the indigenous peoples of the country in line with the UN Declaration. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Pueblo Originario Quichua de Sarayaco. I now call upon the representative of Mexico.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam Chair, I'd like to congratulate you on your appointment, and I'd like to pass on the congratulations of the President of Mexico, Madam Sheinbaum. She has expressed her solidarity with indigenous peoples, particularly with indigenous women. Mexico reaffirms our commitment to the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in order to guarantee the exercise of their collective rights, respect for their forms of organization, and their right to self-determination. Mexico has carried out several actions in order to implement the Declaration. The constitutional reform, for example, on the rights of indigenous peoples of African descent in Mexico, that was approved after a long period of consultation with indigenous peoples. The reform recognizes the multicultural nature of Mexico with regard to its very many ethnicities that have their own identity and property. This is covered by Article 3 of the Declaration. The reform has been translated into 74 indigenous languages. We also prepared a general law on the rights of indigenous peoples, African-Mexican individuals, including the participation of legislators, indigenous peoples, and legislators of the state. This is essential for access to justice and the protection of cultural goods and land, and also provides mechanisms for ensuring consultation and prior informed consent. We're making progress regionally, working with the indigenous communities, ensuring their participation. We'll be working in 25 different areas this year. We also promote the recognition of indigenous peoples, recognizing almost 16,000 indigenous communities. And this year they will be able to benefit from public resources for the first time. Chair, we suggest a global meeting of experts in Mexico as part of the Year of Indigenous Peoples in order to further develop this declaration. That workshop seminar will be conducted by Raul Kitcha, who has devoted their lives to protecting indigenous peoples, and we hope that you could include this in your recommendations. Finally, we reiterate our commitment to the preparation of a legally binding instrument that will make it possible to ensure the implementation of the rights included in the declaration. Thank you very much.
The representative of Mexico. I now call upon the representative of the Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Issues.
Mr. Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to speak today on behalf of the Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Issues, a network of 41 members dedicated to advancing the full spectrum of the rights of indigenous peoples, children, youth, and adults alike, globally. Through a strengthened coordination across the UN system, the Interagency Support Group promotes the implementation of the provisions of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At the outset, we extend our congratulations to the newly appointed chair, Ms. Kotierk. Since its establishment in 2002, the Interagency Support Group has been a steadfast partner in supporting the mandate of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and has worked to promote indigenous peoples' rights across the UN system and to advocate for the inclusion of indigenous peoples' rights, perspectives, and priorities into global policies and programs. To advance this mission, the Interagency Support Group has established dedicated thematic working groups, including those focused on developing an accountability framework for the United Nations System-Wide Action Plan on Indigenous Peoples, developing communications strategies, fostering direct financing for indigenous peoples, protecting indigenous human rights defenders, and on strengthening the engagement of UN resident coordinators and United Nations country teams on indigenous peoples' rights. The Interagency Support Group actively contributes to capacity building initiatives, supports the implementation of the recommendations of the UN Permanent Forum, and strengthens indigenous peoples' participation across UN processes. In October 2024, the Interagency Support Group delivered a statement at the second intersessional meeting of the Human Rights Council, calling for concrete measures to enhance indigenous peoples' engagement in the Council's work. Our commitment remains unwavering in ensuring indigenous voices are heard and respected within our respective entities and throughout the UN system. We remain steadfast in our commitment to work with indigenous peoples and member states to implement the UNDRIP and other relevant international human rights commitments. We look forward to continued collaboration with the UN Permanent Forum and to strengthening our collective efforts to uphold indigenous peoples' rights. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the IASG. I now call upon the representative of the National Congress of American Indians.
Bien, merci. Madam Chair, my name is Laura Ann Chasson. I am the Principal Chief of the United Homa Nation. I speak on behalf of the National Congress of American Indians and the Native Americans Rights Funds. The UN Declaration affirms the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous people worldwide. Since its adoption, it has positively influenced the drafting of several constitutions and status of the nations and local levels of contributing to the progress of development of international and national legal framework, jurisprudence, and policies. Great progress has also been made within the Human Rights Council, including through the establishment of dialogues within the UN Special Rapporteur of the Rights of Indigenous People, standing for indigenous participation in the dialogues and appointments of the indigenous co-facilitators for Human Rights Council negotiation. While positive steps has been taken to implement the declaration, more deliberate, sustained, and inclusion action is needed to fully realize the ends of declaration, ensuring that indigenous people represent institutions are full and effective contributions to the UN decision-making bodies. Toward that end, we respectfully urge the forum to recommend that the Human Rights Council consider extending the standing modality of the participation for the indigenous people in their interactive dialogue with the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people and the EM-RIP to other relevant dialogue and discussion strengthening and the direct participation of indigenous people in its work. The high-level panel to be held during the 82nd session of the General Assembly in the 2027 reflects the level, ambition, substance, and the impact befitting to a high-level meeting. As such, it must align with the original recommendation of the forum, and it must not serve as a platform to reconsider or undermine the established, recognize or institutionalization of the rights of indigenous people and the indigenous people representative institutions ensure full, effective participation in the planning, design, and conducting the 2027 high-level panel in accordance with the Article 18 and 41 of the Declaration. Finally, we urge the member status to redouble effect to realize that the rights of self-determination for the indigenous people by ensuring.
I thank the representative of the National Congress of American Indians. I now call upon the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia.
Thank you very much, Sister Chair. Thank you very much to all of the brothers and sisters participating in this very important event. 18 years now since the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which lives and breathes in our Constitution of Bolivia, in the public laws which over this course of time we have approved in favor of indigenous peoples. Today I come with proposals to strengthen the agenda of the forum and provide solutions to the structural crises that are afflicting humanity and the world. 1. Establish a working group to strengthen the mandate of all fora that have been established till now. 2. We ask the WHO to take the coca leaf off the 1961 list of prohibited items. 3. Continue with decolonization of the United Nations University. 4. Through UNICEF, recognize the codification of living well. 5. Support the draft resolutions of Uipala as a symbol of harmony and balance with Mother Earth. 6. To approve the convening of the Assembly of Mother Earth to a World Summit of Mother Earth in 2030. 7. To implement the Amazon mechanisms that recognize the leading role of indigenous peoples of the Amazon region in defending Mother Earth, as well as the forestry mechanism. And finally, in this forum, I invite all indigenous peoples of the world to participate in the global meeting of Mother Earth for living well that will be held from the 2nd to the 4th of August of 2025 in Cochabamba as part of the bicentenary of independence, and we hope to achieve positive results for the agenda of indigenous peoples and for the world. We hope that the decisions of this forum will help us to make these things a reality, and Bolivia is fully committed to all of these agreements and above all to the fight and demands of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples of the world, we defend you.
I thank the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. I now call upon the representative of UNEP.
Madam Chair, esteemed member of the Permanent Forum, Excellencies, distinguished delegate, and representative of Indigenous peoples. Madam Chair, congratulations on your election. Your leadership comes at a critical time when the voices of Indigenous people are more important than ever in shaping the global discourse on human rights and sustainability. UNEP stands in solidarity with Indigenous people worldwide and unites in its commitment to uphold the principles set forth in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Indigenous peoples are custodians of some of the world's most diverse, biodiverse and culturally significant ecosystems. Their traditional knowledge, sustainable practices, and rights to lands, territories, and resources are vital to achieving global environmental goals, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Upholding UNDRIP is a legal and moral obligation, but also an ecological imperative. As we address the pressing global environmental challenges, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, UNEP remains committed to working with member states and other relevant stakeholders to ensure the effective integration of the rights of Indigenous people into environmental policies and practices. In 2024, UNEP developed 10 core human rights principles for private conservation organizations and founders with input and guidance from Indigenous people networks and experts. These principles seek to guide private actors toward a human rights-based approach to conservation and to protect Indigenous people's rights. We are now working with all stakeholders to operationalize these principles. Finally, through its ongoing support to the implementation of the UN System-Wide Action Plan on Indigenous Peoples, UNEP reaffirms its commitment to working collaboratively with member states, Indigenous peoples, and other UN entities to ensure the effective implementation of the UNDRIP. By recognizing and valuing Indigenous rights and knowledge, we can create a more just and sustainable future for all. Thank you.
I thank the representative of UNEP, and now I call upon the representative of Taungurung Land and Waters Council.
Thank you, Chair. As CEO of the Lowitja Institute and a Tanarong citizen, we urgently call for action to increase Indigenous control and ownership of Indigenous health and population data globally. As outlined in the United Nations Declarations of Indigenous People, it establishes a broad framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity and well-being of Indigenous peoples across the world, and to create a space and impetus to ask how Indigenous peoples can be supported to drive our own agenda. Article 31 reaffirms the rights of Indigenous peoples to access and control data about our people's territories, lifeways and resources. We call on member states and UN agencies to meet their obligations to fully implement Article 31 of UNDRIP and convene a meeting to discuss decolonised approaches and actions to identifying sources and quality of country-level Indigenous administrative health and population data, and to identify gaps in the availability and accessibility of data. Implement models of Indigenous control and ownership of Indigenous health and population data, which ensures control over the data ecosystem, as well as provide stewardship and management of data collection. We urge the UN member states and agencies to produce an overview of models to support the Indigenous governance of data systems, including investment in global infrastructure to support Indigenous data sovereignty and long-term health equity. Commit to understanding the requirements for ongoing monitoring of Indigenous people's health and social outcomes, including global governance and infrastructure. Globally, Indigenous administrative data is the key to monitoring of Indigenous rights to health. Data is a valuable resource and a strategic and economic asset for Indigenous peoples. There is an international movement of Indigenous peoples working to advance self-determination and decolonisation in matters of data, with the agenda to increase Indigenous control and ownership of Indigenous health and population data. We want true decision-making power over our data to ensure our rights and interests are reflected in data policies and practices. Finally, we call the forum to specifically focus on Indigenous determinants of health at next year's permanent forum and to make recommendations to UN agencies to utilise the Indigenous determinants of health measurement instrument that was presented this morning to conduct a self-evaluation on their conceptual and operational structures based on the Indigenous determinants of health and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Congratulations, Chair, on your appointment, and thank you.
I want to thank the member from the Land and Water Council, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Australia is dedicated to improving the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples through meaningful partnerships to enhance the dignity and rights of Indigenous communities. This is why we work closely with communities to implement the principles of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is also why we're here at this year's permanent forum to hear the Indigenous peoples and member states about their best practice examples and lessons learned in UNDRIP application. For Australia, we demonstrate our commitment to UNDRIP through the collaborative approach to policies and programs which impact Indigenous Australians to ensure that the principles of UNDRIP are consistently reflected. Since endorsing UNDRIP in 2009, Australia has actively translated its principles into practical actions. This includes the National Agreement in Closing the Gap, which represents the landmark commitment to transforming the relationship between governments and Indigenous Australians. Closing the Gap seeks to foster self-determination, cultural respect and better life outcomes for Indigenous Australians. It is based on the belief that when Indigenous peoples have the genuine say in the design and delivery of policies, programs and services, better life outcomes are achieved. Closing the Gap emphasises the need for structural changes in government interactions with Indigenous Australians, particularly through priority reforms, which focuses on formal partnerships, shared decision-making, building the Indigenous community-controlled sector and transforming government organisations. Empowering communities is a cornerstone of Australia's efforts, which aligns with UNDRIP's Article 18 on participation in decision-making. Empowering communities gives way to Indigenous peoples to lead and design models for shared decision-making with government. These models elevate First Nations perspectives on development in their regions by bringing leaders and community members to the table with governments as trusted partners. This model fosters harnesses Indigenous leadership and facilitates community priority and agenda setting. Chair, we recognise that implementing UNDRIP is an ongoing process of improvement and learning. Unfortunately, several targets have not been changed and in some cases have even regressed. Statistics in areas such as youth justice and the protection of children and social wellbeing have not improved and are challenges that our communities are continuously contending with. To support sustained and meaningful dialogue, Australia has established a National Commission for Aboriginal Children and Young People to protect and promote the rights of Indigenous children and young people. In the spirit of reflection and learning, Australia looks forward hearing from others around the world about initiatives that seek to advance the lives of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I thank the representative for their statement. I now would like to give the floor to Permanent Forum member, Ms. Hannah McGlade.
Because it's really important that people understand actually what Aboriginal people are experiencing in our country and what most vulnerable members of our community, Aboriginal children, are experiencing. It's a worsening crisis. The Closing the Gap policy, which is probably dating back 20 years now, has seen successive failures and actually a widening of the gap in three key areas, namely Aboriginal incarceration, suicides and Aboriginal child removals today, causing incredible suffering and pain for our communities. We have no longer an independent representative institution, which is our right under the UN Declaration. Governments are consulting closely with a coalition of peaks who are made up of Aboriginal organisations that receive funding from governments and who cannot speak freely for fear of losing their funding. We've had important Senate inquiries over the last year or two, including a Senate inquiry into the implementation of UNDRIP, which recommended a national action plan to achieve this objective. Now, that hasn't happened. It's really important that we progress the national action plan and as well as the Senate inquiry outcomes report in relation to the protection of Aboriginal cultural heritage. For too long, our heritage sites have been destroyed by mining companies with no respect for free, prior, informed consent. And we have, at this time, we have some advice from the UN Committee on Elimination of Race Discrimination that Aboriginal heritage laws in West Australia, which have not been reformed, violate our rights to FPIC and the Convention. There's a worsening crisis in regards to Aboriginal children as states and territories have passed regressive laws over the last 6 months, including lowering the age of criminal responsibility to a mere 10 years. We have now the principle of detention as a measure of last resort prohibited in Queensland. We've seen regressive bail laws in Victoria which will result in more Aboriginal children being incarcerated, and in my state Aboriginal children are incarcerated in an adult prison. So we have over Christmas and recently compiled an early warning urgent action communication with the Human Rights Law Centre to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Race Discrimination, showing this to be a systemic pattern of race discrimination which is actually now taking the lives of Aboriginal children.
I thank Permanent Forum Member Ms. Hannah McGlade. I'd now like to give the floor to Raipan.
I'm representing an umbrella association of 40 indigenous peoples in Russia. The small indigenous peoples in Russia have a special legal status because of their distinctive lifestyle, which is based on their inalienable link with the land, the fact that they're dispersed, that they live remotely, and because their population is critically small. And this is something that's enshrined in the country's constitution. The Constitution for us is a source of our collective rights and also a most important instrument of our legal protection. Several times it was the case that on the basis of constitutional provisions, the representatives of the indigenous peoples addressed the Constitutional Court, and decisions there were made which restored their specific rights and also reformed the law. There are 3 special federal laws which developed the notion of constitutional acknowledgement of special roles. A number of sectoral federal laws also enshrine the right on the priority use of natural resources. At the same time, the indigenous peoples, and especially when it comes to access to natural resources, would like to state that there is a need to improve the mechanisms through which we realize our rights. For example, the federal law provides for a right for traditional hunting and fishing, but implementing this at the level of bylaws is something that needs to be significantly improved upon. Therefore, currently, for example, the federal parliament is considering the initiative put forward by our umbrella association to streamline the process associated with the, implementing the right to traditional fishing. Also, despite the possibility we have of developing regional legislation, a number of provisions on the division of labor requires changes in the federal law. And first and foremost, when it comes to accessing national resources and making real use of priority access to the fauna and water resources. There is a need for a state to have a federal law on assessing the impact of development projects on us, enshrining the status of a reindeer breeder status, making more strict the environmental laws when it comes to gold mining companies. States need to broaden the possibilities for indigenous peoples in the discussion and promoting their legal initiatives, and also our participation in decision-making in legislative and executive bodies of power. We recommend to the Permanent Forum to prepare a study on the participation of indigenous peoples in parliamentary activities and in lawmaking. I thank you.
I want to thank the representative from Raipan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Уважаемый господин председатель.
Distinguished Chair, the Russian Federation is following the goals in the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People and in good faith following the provisions of the final document of the World Conference that help increasing the importance of indigenous people's rights. We fully agree that the basis for the promotion declarations is to have a legal recognition of indigenous peoples of their rights. This is a precondition for any subsequent work. The Russian Constitution, for example, as well as the federal and regional laws acknowledge all of the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples. We also have thousands of bylaws. A huge part of peoples in Russia have their own autonomies in the form of republics, autonomous districts, and national municipal regions. And this provides a possibility for developing specific regional laws and creating their specific executive and legislative bodies on the issues of indigenous issues. In the very near future, we expect that we will have an updated federal concept for the sustainable development of small indigenous peoples and plans for its implementation. Another thing that's being finalized is the presidential decree on establishing a yearly day for small indigenous peoples to make it on the 30th of April, which is the day when the federal law on their rights was passed. The Federal Act on Traditional Lands allows lands where the indigenous people are less than 1% of the population, but have the priority right to use nature and biological resources. This law covers about 30% of the entire territory of Russia. This is more than the territory of Western and Central Europe. Such vast territories, when they are acknowledged to be traditional lands, this inevitably leads to making sure that this status is implemented. And very few countries have encountered such a challenge. Therefore, indeed, once you have a broad legal recognition of the rights of indigenous people, well, this is followed by looking for effective mechanisms for implementation. And this is particularly difficult for those states where tens of thousands of indigenous peoples live. And in this regard, states and indigenous peoples need to continue being in a dialogue with each other so as to settle those issues which cannot be resolved in their stead by international institutions. And what is needed is helping the national negotiations along and disseminating more information about that. We need to improve the collective position of indigenous people, which is more comprehensive in nature and can provide effective guidelines for decision-making.
Thank the distinguished member from the Federation of Russia. I now give the floor to Gestor Forum des Femmes Marocaines. Excuse me.
سيد الرئيس المحترم حضور الكريم نشكر.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished members of the forum, we would like to thank the forum on the indigenous issues for the important work it's been doing for years. In this framework, as an NGO and civil society organization in Morocco, we work on the issues of Anasazi culture and implemented a great deal of accomplishments here, including the recognition of Anasazi New Year and a budget between 2020 and 2025, all the while introducing the Anasazi language in various bodies. The coverage here was about 40%, despite the initiatives undertaken by the Ministry of Justice to introduce the Amazigh language in Moroccan courts. Nonetheless, it is a fact that the language has to be strengthened so as to improve access to justice. and accelerate the amendment of Article 14 of the law on the Amazigh language. We have to ensure that we have 100% coverage, and this is a major challenge for us. The budget allocated is not enough. We also call on the National Council of Languages to have an inclusive approach, ensuring cultural diversity. As a result of the population census, the most recent one, as a result of that, we call for the revitalization of our language, preventing its decline, and to do it through programs based on participation, because Amazigh culture and language is important. It's thousands of years old. I thank you.
I thank the representative for your statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Señor Presidente.
Chair, delegations, representatives of indigenous peoples and the United Nations system. Greetings from the government of Chile. It's an honor as Under-Secretary General for Social Services to participate in this forum to collectively progress on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This declaration is a central instrument for building a new pact between states and indigenous peoples. In line with that vision, my government recognizes that we live in an intercultural society and that we need to make progress on restoring land and revitalizing culture. According to that approach, one of the most important steps has been the establishment of the Commission for Understanding under the presidency, started in 2023 to deal with the Mapuche land claim issues. More than 200 meetings have been convened with representatives of indigenous peoples and social organizations. Chile continues to promote participation and with indigenous peoples following our national laws as well as those of the ILO. These instruments have made it possible to carry out various consultations in the environment, energy and public works, for example, but we know that there are still challenges that remain, and that's why we continually work to increase good faith and trust in these fora. Culturally, we have undertaken to promote languages specifically. This year we'll see the Indigenous Languages Plan being included in the UNESCO Year for Indigenous Peoples, promoting indigenous languages and also accompanying that with various laws relating to cultural heritage. We're also designing a special statute strengthening self-governance and bilingualism as a policy of state for indigenous peoples. President Boric recognizes all rights of indigenous peoples as important to policy and practice. We recognize the difficulties in legislation, but we promise to engage in dialogue and effective implementation and recognize the diversity that strengthens our country. Thank you.
I thank the representative from Chile, and I now give the floor to the Association of Kolasami.
Thank you very much. I represent the Association of the Kola Sami of Russia. The Sami people lives in 4 northern states in Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia, where therefore attach a great deal of importance to international cooperation. Article 36 of the Declaration enshrines the rights of cross-border peoples to support and develop their contacts and ask the states to help with the implementation. Article 39 enshrines our right to financial and technical assistance from states and international cooperation. Articles 41 and 42 talk about the role of the UN, but what is it that we see in practice? The states ignore their obligations to support the international cooperation, and instead of funding cooperation, they can use that money so as to manipulate people and destroy our contacts. Instead of helping with sustainable development, they undermine it through unilateral coercive measures. Let me give you one egregious example. In 2022, we received a letter from the International Organization of the Sami about suspending cooperation with Sami organizations in Russia. As a reason, it was stated that the donors, these northern countries, demanded that Western Sami cease cooperation with Sami in Russia and threatened the withdrawal of funding this way. The main goal of the Sami Council is to strengthen the unity of our people. In other words, the northern country, by threatening the Sami Council, are violating the Articles 36 and 39 of the Declaration. They essentially destroyed the cooperation of the indigenous people in the Arctic Council. At the same time, worried about their reputation at the Permanent Forum, the northern countries continue talking about support to the broadening of indigenous people's participation at the UN. We call on the northern countries to stop exerting pressure on international contacts. We also call upon all states to help with the international cooperation through various visa and logistic measures. In this regard, we support the statement made on the eve of the 24th session that it is important to make sure that indigenous peoples participate in the UN, and every year this becomes increasingly more difficult. We call on the Forum to consider the possibility of moving our yearly sessions to UN offices which are more favorable, Bangkok or Nairobi. We also ask the Forum to study the impact of unilateral coercive measures onto the implementation of indigenous people's rights. Thank you.
For their statement, and I'd now like to give the floor to the distinguished member from Nepal.
Madam Chair, Nepal is understanding example in terms of embracing diversity as well as processing and protecting the rights of indigenous people. We have independent principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that are fundamental to promoting justice, equality, and recognition of indigenous communities. The Constitution Law of Nepal guarantees the rights of indigenous communities. We have implemented many progressive measures to ensure such rights. With the introduction of personal representation and reservation system, we have witnessed ever increasing representation of indigenous people both in politics as well as in administrative domain of the country. Attempts have been made to ensure the integration of indigenous knowledge and practices into international conservation strategies. The government offers social protection grants, including monthly allowances for indigenous group. As a party to ILO Convention 169, Nepal remains committed to preserving the identity, language, and culture of indigenous people. Madam Chair, despite these initiatives, there remain significant challenge in delivering health, education, desired work, economic opportunities, and other outcomes. We therefore call upon the international community to provide support for investment in these areas. Let's work together to drive progress and create a brighter future for all indigenous communities. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished member from Nepal, and I now give the floor to the Regional Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North of the Krasnoyarsk Krai.
Mr. Chair, I represent the Association of 8 indigenous peoples in the Krasnoyarsk Krai in the Russian Siberia. The territory of the Krai is on the threshold of receiving new large-scale economic development projects. We have nothing against development, but only provided that our rights are taken into account. In Russia, the declaration provisions are reflected in the Constitution and our laws. Amendments to the constitutions which were passed at all people voting 5 years ago not only confirmed our rights and roles, but also had provisions on language and culture added to them. And we can see a great potential for reforming legislation through participating in parliamentary work. The representatives of our people are elected into federal, regional parliaments. For example, the Krasnoyarsk Krai Parliament has 3 indigenous peoples. Another way of influencing law-making is through the councils of indigenous people's representative at regional governments. The council convey our opinions and impact legislation. Unfortunately, municipalities very frequently do not create such council, despite the fact that they have the right to do it. This way, the development of the parliamentary work by the indigenous people's work give us a possibility of making sure the declaration becomes part of the Russian legal system. We recommend that the forum systematize the practice of legislative work by indigenous people as the main way of implementing the declaration nationally. At the same time, since 2023, we've basically been deprived of representation at international level. From our socio-cultural region, we have a person representing the permanent forum, which is elected without consultations. Furthermore, whom we have is a person who is a Sami person representative, even though the Sami and Inuits are different socio-cultural regions in Arctica. And we have sent many letters about that to ECOSOC. A week ago, ECOSOC elected 2 people from states of Eastern Europe who are openly hostile in their language towards indigenous peoples in Russia and who do not provide such legal recognition. At the same time, 90% of all indigenous peoples of the sociocultural region live in Russia. But for the second term in a row, we are without our experts in the permanent forum. So what kind of trust can you, in the UN, can you be talking about if the procedures we already agreed upon do not work effectively? I thank you.
I thank the representative for your statement. I now call on the distinguished member from Guatemala.
Thank you, Chair, members of the Permanent Forum. Greetings from Guatemala. And Greetings from Guatemala and our government. We hope that this forum will lead to many decisions being taken. With regard to diversity in Guatemala, we are working on an agenda that will guarantee the promotion and preservation of all the cultures of Guatemala and the indigenous peoples that make up the country. Each language expresses the vision of the world and the beliefs that those peoples have. That's why it's important to ensure that we maintain the 24 languages in Guatemala that have been there for so long. When we talk about challenges, well, some of these indigenous languages are in danger of becoming extinct because of various social and historical circumstances. It's the responsibility of the state to ensure that we maintain these different views of the universe. In 2003, we passed various laws to recognize the importance of the 22 Mayan languages, and those of African descent and of Hispanic descent. The Mayan Language Institute has been very important in promoting languages based on the original Mayan language and has established grammar for each language so that the families can teach the language. However, it's unfortunate that families are not continuing to do this work. The Ministry of Education is therefore working to preserve these languages in the main areas where these languages are spoken. Oral traditions are also very important to preserve these languages and texts, and there are texts produced in bilingual versions. We would like to benefit from this forum to highlight our fight for these languages. This is very important for the rights of the indigenous peoples of Guatemala, and to ensure that no one is forgotten. In the words of Alberto Cabal, speaking about not forgetting, he said that if I were to walk alone into the future, I could tell you what it means to prevent us forgetting.
Nicaragua.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. The Government of National Reconciliation and Unity in Nicaragua welcomes this 24th session of the Permanent Forum, and we reiterate our firm commitment to the respect, promotion and protection of the rights of native peoples and those of African descent. Nicaragua is multi-ethnic and pluricultural. This is our diverse identity, and we have promoted policies that strengthen the pride that we have in our ancestral roots, guaranteeing inclusion and active participation of native peoples in all areas of national life, political, economic, social and cultural. Since 2007, we've made sustained progress in implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including them effectively in our public policies and development plans. Nicaragua is proud to highlight the creation of the first indigenous university for agriculture and livestock rearing, established on ancestral lands, known as the first indigenous intercultural university of Latin America. Its model of education is inclusive and multicultural and responds to the needs of the communities, and is the result of coordinated efforts between institutions of the state, community leaders, regional autonomous governments and the national government, reaffirming the commitment of Nicaragua to a transformative education with identity and social justice. We welcome the progress that has been made by native peoples in social, cultural and very many other areas. This progress speaks to the resilience of our communities defending their rights, their land and their ancestral knowledge. Chair, The government of Nicaragua reaffirms its commitment to the self-determination of native peoples, respecting their right to define their political condition and their economic and social forms of development. We protect them and their languages and lands and forms of community organization as a basis for their historic continuity and full participation in our society. In conclusion, we once again repeat that we will continue to work to ensure dignity, autonomy and the rights of native peoples, guaranteeing their full participation in building a fairer, more equitable and sustainable future of well-being and living well for all. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative from Nicaragua, and I'd like to give the floor to the representative of Stitching Mulakat.
Honorable Délégué, merci.
Distinguished delegates, Mr. Chair, thank you. I speak now on behalf of threatened people. We have been the guardians of the land for our practices. We're one with the forests. However, we are facing major challenges which imperil our rights and our very existence. First of all, mineral exploitation pollutes our rivers by toxic substances and impoverish our fauna. We have health problems because of mercury poisoning. Second, the government of Suriname has not recognized the indigenous peoples of Suriname, didn't recognize us, and have been several times condemned for that. Our lands are being used and we had to move. We don't have legal protection for ourselves, our lands. We're very vulnerable to exterior actors who want to exploit our resources. As was shown through the mineral extraction industry, our lives and identity is threatened. We call on the government of Suriname to undertake urgent measures and respect our rights, protect our lands, and to guarantee our self-determination. Fighting and to fight against illegal exploitation, protect the environment, and hold those who perpetrate those activities responsible, and provide us with means of alternative subsistence to support adaptation efforts to climate change and strengthen our communities, in particular through access to sustainable practices. In conclusion, we, the Wayana indigenous people, urge the government of Suriname, decision makers in international organizations in Suriname, to give priority to our rights, preserve our cultures, and to work with us to make sure that we have a sustainable future for future generations. I thank you.
I thank the representative for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network.
Yes. Distinguished Chair, esteemed members of the forum, relatives and friends. My name is Bina Nepram, and I greet you in my indigenous language, Mayambu Taram na Okchari. I am deeply honored to address this 24th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, especially on today, which is Earth Day. Our Earth is, you know how many years old? 4.5 billion years old. But we are at the moment in history where we have 107 wars and 120 million displaced. There can be no planetary health without peace, and no true peace without healing of lands, peoples, water, and spirits. Currently, 80% of the world's conflicts are happening in biodiversity areas where indigenous people live. This is unacceptable and must change. The good news is that the United Nations Declaration has aspects of how to bring about peace, and we must return back. Also, in December 2024, the United Nations General Assembly passed a historic resolution, A/79/455, recognizing the importance of engaging with indigenous people in peace agreements, negotiations, transitional justice, conflict resolution, mediation, and constructive arrangements. We thank all the UN member states and all at UNFPI for making this happen. This is an example of how we, the indigenous people, can work with the UN and the member states. Do not be afraid of us. We are as human as you, and we want to be a part of your process. The resolution follows the work done by our elders for centuries at the historic first Global Summit on Indigenous Peacebuilding held last year in Washington, D.C., where 120 Indigenous peacebuilders leaders met. At the summit, an international declaration on Indigenous peacebuilding was adopted. We call upon the United Nations to recognize Indigenous peacebuilding. We also called for the UN Secretary General's report on Indigenous peacebuilding to be done, to declare 2025 to 2035 as International Decade on Indigenous People, ensure zero tolerance of wars in our conflict. We also call for the call of dedicated resource mechanisms. We call upon Indigenous people, women in all conflict prevention strategies. The planet is calling for healing. Indigenous people have heard the call since the beginning of time. Let us walk forward in peace with the humility to listen and the courage to change. Include indigenous people as equal partners in all decisions affecting the earth.
I thank the representative for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative from Paraguay.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings from the Paraguayan state. We very much appreciate this forum for dialogue. It's very important for the indigenous peoples of the world. Paraguay has the wealth of 19 indigenous peoples within our borders with their own identities that existed before the formation of the state. This has been recognized in the constitution, various constitutions of our republic. It's also led to the development of a body of laws and public policies which are very helpful in terms of recognition of rights and making progress in the implementation of the declaration. But having said that, over the years that we've been working, I think it does have to be clear today that the challenges that we face go beyond recognizing rights. We need to guarantee, much rather, that they are respected and protected. Today I'm speaking on behalf of Paraguay in my role as General Ombudsperson at the Ministry for Public Defense. Participating in this meeting is not just a commitment, but it's also a specific expression of our constitutional mandate, namely guaranteeing access to justice for everyone without discrimination, particularly those in situations of greater vulnerability. Access to justice is not just being able to go to a court, but also it's a way for people to be able to exercise and ensure that their rights are respected without regard to economic and social barriers. It's the obligation of the state to ensure that any barriers be removed. In this respect, indigenous peoples, historically and in reality, have been one of the groups that have been prioritized. We have now included in the organizational chart of our ministry a directorate for indigenous peoples, and we've been going through the country participating in atiguasus. They are traditional assemblies where we've listened to the voices of indigenous peoples. This direct contact has made me understand that distance is not just a geographical concept, but also it's an institutional distance. Many communities find that the state is not present in their areas. But today, with the Paraguayan Institute for Indigenous Issues, we are presenting a draft to the executive to create a national network for indigenous people's rights in order to ensure their presence in various sectors such as education, health, and justice. This should strengthen actions that already exist in our national plan for indigenous peoples and address economic, social, cultural and environmental rights across the board and ensure free, prior and informed consent.
I thank the distinguished representative from Paraguay, and I now give the floor to the representative from the Grand Council of the Crees, EU Istichi.
I am pleased to present the following joint statement on behalf of Croatia for the human rights of indigenous peoples, which brings together indigenous nations and organizations, as well as civil society partners across Canada. This statement addresses the implementation of declaration. We recommend to the permanent forum that consists with their international human rights obligation, states must develop in cooperation and the consultation with the indigenous peoples. Comprehensive national actions plans to fully implement the declaration, such as plans must set out concrete steps to advance implementation with appropriate timelines. That consents with the paragraph 7 of the outcome document of the World Conference, particularly emphasizes that should be given to ensuring legislators and civil servants and judicial understands the rights to set out the declaration and the obligation to uphold these rights. That consistent with the standard of free, prior, and informed consent, measures must be put in place to ensure the transparency, accountability, and oversight regarding what implementation steps will be taken, how they will be taken in cooperation and consultations with these indigenous peoples. These measures must be supported by financial commitment to ensure these indigenous peoples have the technology capacity to participate fully. That states should set up independent indigenous-led monitoring mechanisms to ensure declaration implementation. That the forum recommends actions to be taken so the indigenous peoples of human rights are better integrated throughout the United UN system. In response to the discussion questions posed in the concept note for this dialogue, the people would like to share their experience from Canada. In 2021, Canada became the first member state to adopt national legislative harmonization its laws and policies with the declaration. The legislation required Canada to adopt national action plan detailing the steps to be taken in implementation to the declaration, which was released in 2023. However, Canada, long history with the respect rights of the indigenous people. We are committed to working collaboratively and cooperatively with Canada to address the challenges and implementation across.
I thank the representative for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Kuna pushas kuna. Ecuador Pachung Mingachiwapaishi. Divinidades, autoridades.
Dear authorities, leaders, I'd like to share with you our statement now as the Republic of Ecuador. And we endorse what was said by the group of friends. Constitutionally, Ecuador recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to participate actively in decision-making particularly in those areas that concern them. In particular, our Constitution enshrines these collective rights and lays down the basis for full, respectful participation as part of the plurinational and intercultural state of Ecuador. Ecuador has implemented an identity card for peoples and nationalities, recognizing their belonging as part of public action. We have an essential atlas of peoples, nationalities and languages in Ecuador, providing geo-reference information on diversity, history and the presence of indigenous peoples. We've also formulated a 10-year plan for the revitalization and appreciation of national languages and a national agenda for equality 2025-2029, together with the Sustainable Development Goals. Both instruments have given priority to territorial dialogue with indigenous peoples. It's also important to mention the cultural revitalization through the strengthening of cultural managers of peoples and nationalities of Ecuador. We would like to highlight the first round of negotiations with indigenous peoples, producers and service providers, promoting their access to markets and their economic autonomy. And as part of international cooperation, we stress the signing of the Framework Interinstitutional Agreement with the People's Republic of China and our Secretariat for the Development of Peoples and Nationalities of the Republic of Ecuador. Ecuador also continues to promote intercultural bilingual education using our own teaching models. We invite member states to promote these kinds of exchanges of good practices with indigenous peoples, and we would propose the holding of regional meetings to make visible the progress that has been made. And finally, we've taken due note of the Quicho-Sarayac statement. Ecuador is committed to promoting institutional links to implement the rulings of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We are committed to strengthening multilateralism in order to guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Representative from Ecuador, and I now give the floor to Taiki Yuki.
Hello. Oh, great. My name is Claire Charters. I'm from Ngāti Whakauwea of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I speak on behalf here of the National Tribal Nations Leaders Forum, Wairarapa Moana Incorporation, and Wakatū. New Zealand's current government and the Minister of Foreign Affairs specifically has expressly rejected the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It has made a commitment to not implement the declaration. Another governmental coalition partner campaigned nationally against the implementation of the declaration. New Zealand's policy on the declaration sits alongside its legislative strategy to dismantle Māori rights in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which has received global attention for its regressiveness. This lack of implementation of the declaration is consistent with the government's failure to respect decisions of New Zealand's highest court, the Supreme Court, in relation to Māori rights. Contrary to the Supreme Court decision in the Wakatū case, the government has delayed and denied its duties to customary Māori owners to respect their rights to lands, self-determination, redress, and to take part in cultural life. Similarly, in the Wairarapa case, the government has effectively and legislatively overridden the Supreme Court's decision to return lands to Māori tribal owners. The Special Rapporteur has raised this issue with New Zealand and received a non-response. The lack of implementation of the declaration, including the deliberate undermining of our highest court when legally recognising our rights, is a serious breach of the rule of law and New Zealand's obligations under international law and policy. Moreover, the New Zealand government has ignored the expert mechanisms request for a follow-up country visit to support New Zealand's implementation of the declaration. We call on the Permanent Forum to take all measures, alongside the UN Special Rapporteur and the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to require all states to implement the declaration and, especially in relation to Aotearoa New Zealand, to reverse any deliberate policy and legislation rejecting the declaration. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Kia ora.
I thank the distinguished representative for their statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Thank you very much, Chair. For Colombia, A World Power for Life, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a parameter that gives life to our public policies. As a multicultural society, we recognize that formal equality is not sufficient. That's why we have adopted specific measures that try to compensate for centuries of exclusion and address the needs of Indigenous peoples. Chair, allow me to highlight 5 areas where my country is making progress. First of all, the promotion of full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in political, social and economic decisions, ensuring that their voices are heard and that their needs are addressed. Secondly, the implementation of the ethnic chapter of the peace agreement signed in 2016 to guarantee the territorial rights and the reparations to be paid to Indigenous communities affected by the armed conflict. 3, full care for victims, women, young people, through the development of policies and programs that will support the victims of the conflict, particularly helping women and Indigenous girls that tend to be the most vulnerable and affected in these situations. 4, the protection of human rights, ensuring security and the protection of the ombudspeople, working to promote human rights, very often facing threats as they conduct their work. And finally, processes of prior consultation of the state to consult with Indigenous peoples when decisions are being taken that could affect the territories, resources and forms of life that they have, and ensuring their right to fully participate. These actions are not just goodwill, but they are moral rights according to UNDRIP and our own conclusion. Finally, we conclude that Indigenous peoples must see their rights protected for biodiversity and for peace for everyone. Thank you.
I thank you for the statement to the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the representative of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Lyudmila Korotkih, and I represent the indigenous people of Ukraine, the Crimean Tatars. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples set a clear standard. Indigenous peoples are not vulnerable groups to be protected. We are rights holders. We have the right to self-determination, to maintain and strengthen our institutions, and to participate in decision-making. Yet the practice in many states shows that these rights are often recognized on paper, but not realized in practice. As indigenous Crimean Tatar people, we have faced more than a decade of occupation by Russian Federation, during which our lands have been militarized, our cultural heritage endorsed, and our rights completely ignored. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 further worsened the situation. At the same time, we must not forget the destructive impact of this war on indigenous people within the Russian Federation itself. Their rights are being violated, their lives lost, and their voices silenced. Unfortunately, similar patterns are found in other regions, where indigenous peoples are excluded from decisions concerning extractive projects, infrastructure development, or military operations on their lands. These cases demonstrate a systematic problem: the failure to recognize indigenous governance system and to implement FPIC not as a formality, but as a legally binding obligation. In Ukraine, the adoption of the 2021 law on indigenous peoples was a historic step. However, the lack of implementation, including delays in providing legal status to representative institutions and adopting key bylaws, weakens this progress. The lesson is clear: symbolic recognition is not enough. We acknowledge that positive practice do exist in some regions where Indigenous peoples have been granted space for self-governance and policy co-creation. These examples show that when Indigenous peoples are included as equals, the outcomes are more just, democratic, and sustainable. And I would like to emphasize the importance of the ongoing process to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the work of UN, particularly in the Human Rights Council. I sincerely hope that the recommendations made by Indigenous representatives during the intersessional meetings will be taken into account and reflected in the upcoming resolution. We call on UN member states to ensure that national frameworks fully align with UN DRIP and guarantee the genuine, effective, and institutionalized participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes. The UN system to strengthen coordination and accountability for the rights of Indigenous peoples across its agencies, and to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard not only in forums like these, but in all UN processes from peace building to climate actions. The future of Indigenous peoples must not be decided without Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I thank the representative for their statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Suriname.
Thank you, Chair. Suriname aligns itself with the CARICOM statement delivered by the Minister of Indian Affairs of Guyana and would like to add the following in its national capacity. Suriname supported the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and remains committed to its principles. Respect for cultural diversity and peaceful coexistence are distinct characteristics of Suriname's multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, and multilingual society. These characteristics are the foundation of our adherence to the principle of non-discrimination and equality. National policy frameworks are based on an inclusive development approach aimed at leaving no one behind. There are several programs to ensure the advancement of the quality of life of our indigenous and tribal peoples, as these communities also have the right to equal opportunities, among others, in education, healthcare, and employment. In addition, there are ongoing efforts to improve effective and meaningful consultations with indigenous and tribal peoples in decision-making in areas that have an impact on their rights. The government remains committed to the legal recognition of land rights of indigenous and tribal peoples, a priority that requires an integral approach. Being aware of the remaining concern in this regard, particularly with respect to the amendments on the Bill on Collective Rights of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, there is ongoing dialogue to resolve concerns. In conclusion, Chair, the government of the Republic of Suriname remains committed to the promotion and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in Suriname, including the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative for their statement. I now call on Indigenous parliamentarian Mariana Yambe Yaliko.
Gracias, Presidente. Mariana.
Thank you, Chair. Mariam Mumbai from Ecuador. After years of fighting on the part of indigenous peoples, we now have the constitutional reform decided in 2008, where we included intercultural and multi-ethnic issues. Indigenous peoples are now recognized as subjects of law, as well as nature is recognized, and also 21 collective rights are recognized, amongst them the right to have our own forms of organization, to exercise authority, to apply our own justice, the right to our lands and to community territories, the right to free, prior and informed consent before legislation is passed, the practicing of ancestral medicine, amongst other things. In other words, those things included in the declaration are included in our constitutional norms. The recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples is important, but if it's not accompanied by political will on the part of governments to implement these rights, then indigenous peoples will continue to be part of the alarming data of poverty, insecurity, inequality, unemployment, lack of access to health and education of quality, lack of access to basic services for and girls and boys with chronic malnutrition, indigenous women that are being raped, also political violence and extractive violence. We will continue to remind future generations of our rights. Leaders of indigenous peoples will are continuing to be criminalized as they try to defend their rights, as in the case of Ecuador. For all of these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Permanent Forum, as well as other bodies represented here, it's a matter of urgency to call upon states to take seriously the guaranteeing of the rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration, with the adoption of laws and plans and programs and projects, and with the participation of indigenous peoples, and not just see us as some sort of folklore. We insist that Ecuador adopt secondary laws aimed at putting flesh on the bones of our rights that are enshrined in the Republic's constitution. We have the law on water, for example, with prior consultation. We must ensure that our rights are not dismantled. States must implement mechanisms
I thank the parliamentarian for her statement, and I call on the distinguished representative from Brazil.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Luan Klepper, and I speak on behalf of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples. Brazil's Constitution of 1988 recognizes indigenous peoples' rights to their ancestral lands, culture, language, social organization, traditions, and beliefs. The chapter about them is on Indians in the plural, not the collective. The collective aspect of indigenous peoples was only made public through UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 2007. Brazilians used to celebrate Indian Day in singular on April 19 until in 2022, a law determined that the holiday should be renamed Indigenous Peoples Day. Our Constitution does not define indigenous peoples, but it does deal with indigenous communities. When the Constitution was drafted, there was a fear that indigenous people would consider themselves to belonging to nations and thus threaten national unity. Article 13 in Chapter 3 on nationality of the Constitution states that the official language of Brazil is Portuguese, ignoring the around 200 indigenous languages that exist in the country. Today, some indigenous languages are recognized as co-official languages in Brazilian municipalities. Perceiving indigenous peoples as a collective is important for several reasons. On the one hand, land demarcation is not just for individuals or communities, but for ethnic groups. There is a cultural and spiritual belonging that unites the peoples. Indigenous peoples were the first populations of the Americas, and their relationship with the territory is defining. Territory means the river, the forest, the environment, not just the ground you walk on. To recognize intellectual property for traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions, you have to deal with both an ethnic group and its intrinsic relationship with its territories. In the current government, for the first time, Brazil has a Ministry of Indigenous Peoples led by an indigenous woman, Sônia Guajajara. And FUNAI, our institution that has been dealing with indigenous peoples since 1967, is also led for the first time in history by an indigenous woman, Joênia Wapichana. The Secretariat for Indigenous Health, SESAI, is headed by an...
I thank the distinguished representative for her statement. I now call on the representatives from the Youth with a Mission.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicodemus Cooper, to the esteemed chairperson of United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We, the indigenous peoples known as the San and Nama of Botswana, guided by our ancestral wisdom and the enduring spirit of self-determination, offer this statement fully aligned with the UN PFF 25 theme, implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People within United Nations member states and the United Nations system, including identifying good practices and addressing challenges. For nearly 6 decades since Botswana independence, our communities, especially our women, have faced systematic marginalization, displacement, and exclusion from decision-making processes. The challenges directly hinder the implementation of principles enshrined in the UNDRIP. We acknowledge and welcome a recent development by Botswana government that can be considered as a good practice: the facilitation of the burial of the San leader, Mr. Gaubereko Pitseng, at the Central Kalahari Game Reserve during the International Human Rights Day of last year was symbolic. The symbolic act signifies a potential shift towards recognizing our spiritual ties to land and cultural practices, acknowledging the profound injustice of the elder being denied burial on his ancestral land for 3 years by the previous administration. This dignified burial, facilitated by the new administration soon after assuming office, offers a hopeful step towards recognizing past violations. Furthermore, the newly established commission to consult with the San people with special focus on our women presents a promise for inclusive dialogue. However, a significant challenge remains: the exclusion of San and Nama NGOs, who are integral to Botswana indigenous heritage, from these own consultations. A Guinean and comprehensive implementation of principles of UNDRIP and free, prior, and informed consent demands the active and meaningful involvement of all indigenous representatives to ensure the legitimacy and effectiveness of these efforts. To advance the implementation of UNDRIP in Botswana, we respectfully urge our government to deepen its commitment by legally recognizing indigenous land tenure and restitution rights, ensuring the protection of traditional lands and preventing forced relocation in full accordance with Articles 25, 26, and 27 of the UNDRIP. We ask for special focus to be given to our indigenous women by institutionalizing indigenous representation within national decision-making structures, including the House of Chiefs.
I thank the representative for his statement, and I now give the floor to Soliman Mamatov, a member of the UN Permanent Forum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear sisters, brothers, representatives of state delegations and international organizations, as we reflect on the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I would like to point on several issues that remain. First, we often hear that the Declaration is soft law, but for indigenous peoples, it is a necessity. The way forward is clear. The more states recognize and implement the Declaration, the more binding its principles become. And we've seen this with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, once considered soft law, and now widely upheld as part of customary international law. Second, while many states express support for the Declaration, the reality on the ground often tells a different story. Here, at the Permanent Forum, we frequently hear contrasting statements from the state delegations and indigenous peoples. That is why initiatives like the Indigenous Navigator are so important, as they help document gaps and monitor implementation, as well as support advocacy based on our right to free, prior, and informed consent, as well as self-determination. Third, meaningful progress depends on recognition, both nationally and internationally. At the international level, enhanced participation of indigenous peoples is essential. At the national level, free, prior, and informed consent must be treated as a fundamental right and principle, not as formality. Fourth, the adoption of the Declaration was made possible by decades of work and negotiations by indigenous peoples. It is now our shared responsibility to turn it into lived reality. I urge states and the UN to establish concrete mechanisms similar to the Universal Periodic Review to track and support implementation. Upholding the rights of indigenous peoples is not only a matter of justice, it is essential to building inclusive and healthy societies. And here I want to stress, as in the previous session, our rights are indispensable and inalienable. Our right to learn, use, and receive education in our languages cannot be fulfilled without adequate political representation and without recognition of our political, economic, and cultural systems and institutions. I thank you.
I thank the member Solomon Mamatov for your intervention. I now call on the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Chair. The government of Guyana has been leading by example in promoting and protecting indigenous rights, people's rights, through two significant pieces of legislation: the Constitution of Guyana, our supreme law, and the Amerindian Act of 2006. Both legislations remain relevant today and aligns with the UN DRIP, which was endorsed by Guyana in 2007. Chair, full engagement with the indigenous people is a reality in Guyana. Annually, the government engages the National Tushaus Council, the body of elected leaders, in a one-week dialogue to discuss their development priorities and inclusion in crafting national development strategies. This is in addition to the robust continuous outreaches by the President and the Cabinet, engaging the indigenous population at the village level. This experience is ongoing implementation of FPIC in Guyana. Chair, our low-carbon development strategy is a product of consultation and endorsement by the indigenous people. We are proud to include indigenous people as equal partners in addressing climate change and the environment, both at the national and international levels. Guyana remains committed to ensuring legal recognition of indigenous peoples' land ownership in line with UN DRIP. The Amerindian Land Titling Project, funded by the government with UNDP as our implementing partner, executes the process set out in the Amerindian Act to ensure land rights and tenure security. Madam Chair, the implementation of this project is not without its challenges. Misinformation on land titling and demarcation creates delays. Guyana stands proud that indigenous people are our second largest landowner in our country, accounting for 16.4% of Guyana land mass. Chair, the Amerindian Act provides for the right to self-determination of our indigenous peoples. This is realized through a democratic process of electing village leaders. The village council is mandated by law to administer and manage village affairs and resources collectively and independently. Regarding the UN systems, the government has established a national mechanism for reporting and follow-up for coordinating, monitoring, and reporting on human rights, including indigenous peoples' rights, under regional and international treaties. While the state continues to respond constructively to all complaints received, we must highlight the persistent challenge where some deliberately disregard domestic remedies in favor of regional and international reporting mechanisms. Chair, we are proud of our successes as we continue to enjoy a good working relationship with Indigenous people in Guyana. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative for their intervention. I now give the floor to Chickaloon Village, Arctic Council, Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, and the Arctic Athabascan Council.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the self-determination and decolonization of Alaska, Hawaii, and there are several other countries also that need to be decolonized under Article 3. Under Article 20, 1 and 2 is subsistence. No peoples are supposed to be deprived of their subsistence, yet the laws in our country does not give us subsistence priority. Article 22, protection of women. We have some of the highest suicide and highest rape and highest murder of Indigenous women in the world. And it's also included the Indigenous men. So now it's murdered and missing Indigenous peoples. Article 29, environment. We're supposed to have informed consent on all of the things going on in our lands. That's not happening. Free, prior, informed consent is supposed to be the basis. It's not. I also find it a little bit strange that here this is the permanent forum, yet we have all these governments taking up the people's time, the Indigenous people's time. And telling us everything's okay in their country. Well, if everything was okay in their countries, why are we all here? Why is this set aside for our people? So I would hope that you put forth these recommendations to not only our country, the people that have taken over Alaska, but also the other indigenous places that need to be decolonized. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the member for their statement. I would now like to give the floor to the UN Permanent Forum member, Tove Sandoval-Gaunt.
Yeah, I just feel called, can you say that in English, to address the statement just made by my friend, Chief Gary, on why we are giving time to the member states in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I think that we need to have a conversation about the establishment and the resolution establishing the Permanent Forum. The objective of the forum was to promote dialogue between Indigenous peoples and member states, and also with the UN system in general, and to advise ECOSOC, which is, still a member state body, on issues related to Indigenous peoples. If we as Indigenous peoples wanted a forum where we only speak to each other, with each other, then we could easily do that. Any Indigenous peoples can call for a conference. But this is not the purpose of this body. The purpose of this body allows us to be in dialogue with member states and with the UN system. So I hope we can take it up later, Chief Gary, and maybe we can have a conversation about the background for establishing this forum. Thank you.
I thank the expert member for her interventions. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished colleagues, Indigenous sisters and brothers,
With its small indigenous population and as one of only a handful of European countries with officially recognized indigenous people, Latvia has been increasingly active in promoting indigenous issues globally. And I think Latvia is a good example of that dialogue between state and indigenous people, because I am indigenous and I'm representing Latvia as a country here. I would hereby like to take also a moment to express our gratitude to all those who supported Latvia's candidacy for membership and participation of its indigenous Livonian people in this distinguished forum for the period of 2026-2028. Since 2021, Latvia has been involved in efforts related to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages initiated by this very forum and curated by UNESCO. As a member of the Global Task Force and also its former co-chair, Latvia has contributed to the development of the Global Action Plan, as well as initiated the creation of 4 ad hoc groups devoted to the status, education, transmission, and digital equality of indigenous languages, the latter of which is also co-chaired by us. The ad hoc groups began their work in the second half of 2023. The first major effort was the collaborative development of the Global Survey of Indigenous Languages launched by UNESCO Global Task Force in March. One of key aims of this survey is to provide data for making informed decisions regarding indigenous languages, and especially to give a voice to indigenous communities so they may be heard by all stakeholders. On behalf of the Global Task Force, I hereby encourage all of you to participate in this survey and make your indigenous voices heard as well. In February 2024, within the framework of IDIL, Language Technology for All conference took place at UNESCO, where numerous issues regarding the presence of indigenous languages in the digital world were discussed. Building on the conference presentations, a global roadmap for multilingualism in digital era is currently being developed at UNESCO. The core of this policy document is the involvement of, respect for, and support to language communities, especially indigenous ones, and their decisions at all stages of building their presence in the digital world and technology. This begins with eliminating the most basic inequalities, such as the ability to produce digital data and to use indigenous languages in everyday technologies. This roadmap also seeks to accumulate knowledge about indigenous languages and proper instruments for building their digital presence. It fosters collaboration and knowledge exchange between language communities and other stakeholders. All of these efforts are part of building resilience and ensuring the flourishing of indigenous languages and people in the world of the future. This is our common goal and responsibility, and we are pleased.
I thank the distinguished representative for their statement, and I now call on the representative of Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum. The Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum.
Strength in the UNRIP is heavily challenged in Asia, particularly the non-recognition of indigenous peoples by many governments, and where there is some recognition, historical and ongoing policies continue to undermine indigenous peoples' sovereignty, rights, and self-governments, coupled with inadequate recognition of their legal rights to land, resource, and self-determination. The situation is particularly grim in Laos, Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Myanmar, Nepal, and India. Indigenous organizations in Laos have become non-operational, and Vietnam risks following suit. In the past, global analysts attribute these challenges to leaders retreating from democracy and the rule of law. In post-Myanmar, the political situation remains unstable, with a military planned elections viewed as a strategy to reinforce its control rather than restore democracy. In Bangladesh, democratic transition faces challenges as the interim government, led by Professor Dr. Muhammad Yunus, grapples with political instability, extreme level of human rights violations against indigenous peoples and religious minorities, economic hardship, and regional tensions. In Northeast India, peace negotiations with indigenous armed groups could contribute to the country's democratization, but the government approach, mixing political talks, military operations, and economic incentives often fosters corruption. In India, since January 2024, over 400 killings by the state forces have been reported. In Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China, one-party rule is country severely limits political activism, leaving little space for indigenous advocacy and democracy progress. In Philippines, the Bangsamoro Indigenous Peoples Act of 2024 adopts the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples (UNRIP) as a part of its regional policy to protect the rights of indigenous peoples in Muslim Mindanao. So, in this context, to effectively implement UNRIP, it is pertinent that the member states' UN system takes serious note of the following recommendations and act with urgency. The Secretary General and other high-level UN officials should their good offices to encourage states to incorporate the provisions of UNRIP in the national laws and policies and take measures to effectively implement the system-wide action plan of UN for the implementation of UNRIP, and particularly the issue of non-recognition of indigenous peoples in their own countries. Prioritize supporting national partners in the reform and implementations of legal frameworks, policies, strategies, and plans that further the UNRIP process through joint programming and other.
I thank the distinguished representative for their statement. I now call on Permanent Forum member Na Ii Min.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The world today faces a convergence of crisis and conflict on an unprecedented scale, including escalating war, political instability, and humanitarian disaster. Ongoing conflict in regions like Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and Myanmar have led to massive displacement, civilian casualty, and destruction of infrastructure. Simultaneously, global challenges such as climate change, food insecurity, and economic inequality are deepening vulnerability, especially among indigenous people. The rise of more centralized form of governance, increasing restriction on civil liberty, and challenges to international cooperation contribute to the complexity of today's global landscape, leaving millions without access to fundamental rights, safety, and justice. Political shifts have reduced space for civil engagement and freedom of expression in some contexts. This complex web of crises demands urgent collective action rooted in human rights, peace building, and environmental sustainability. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a foundational international instrument that affirms the inherent right, dignity, and self-determination of indigenous people worldwide. Its adoption marks a historic step toward correcting centuries of injustice and marginalization. UNDRIP provides a comprehensive framework for government, institutions, and civil society to promote equality, justice, and respect for indigenous culture, identity, and ways of life. UNDRIP is also vital in the context of peace building, as it emphasizes the importance of meaningful participation of indigenous people in decision-making process that affect our life, land, and future. It is essential for member states to recognize the collective right to land, territory, resources, language, culture, and traditional knowledge to address the root cause of conflict and foster reconciliation, healing, and mutual respect. For indigenous communities facing the impact of conflict, forced displacement, environmental degradation, and systematic discrimination, UNDRIP serves as a powerful to assert their rights and protect their identity. It calls on states to work in partnership with indigenous people, grounded in the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and to redress past and present injustice. At present, as presented by the Statement of the Asia Caucus, the non-recognition of indigenous people by many governments persists. Without the recognition of indigenous people in implementation of UNDRIP, there is a gap in having reliable and comparable data across country and region about indigenous people, our rights and needs, which again lead to the lack of provision of basic needs of indigenous people and promotion of our right in respective region. Therefore, it is vital to provide more space and support for the collaborative effort of Indigenous Navigator, which is presented today, also since it is a unique and innovative tool implemented by and for indigenous people. Indigenous people in Asia have long mobilized for self-governance. Our struggle is not isolated. It is deeply intertwined with broader political crisis, democratic movement, and the persistence of authoritarian rule across the region. The movement for indigenous rights reflects a larger call for political reform. Therefore, indigenous people in Asia have been part of the broader movement for political reform, human rights, and resistance against centralized state control. The wider society must recognize that indigenous governance offers a viable and democratic alternative to the exclusionary and oppressive system imposed by nation-states in Asia. Moreover, international advocacy has played a crucial role in supporting indigenous rights. Frameworks such as UNDRIP and ILO Convention 169 provide tools to push government to recognize indigenous sovereignty. In Nepal, indigenous movement use ILO Convention 169 to secure constitutional recognition. In Malaysia, indigenous groups challenged land-grabbing policy through international advocacy. The Philippine Indigenous People Rights Act provides a legal foundation for indigenous people to exercise control over their ancestral domain. These examples show how indigenous movement can strategically engage with international institutions to strengthen our demand and advance reform process. To effectively implement UNDRIP, it is pertinent that the member states' UN system take urgent note of the recommendation provided by the Asia Caucus, and I also would like to add the following recommendation. For the UN agency fund and program to establish a regional interagency working group on indigenous issues in Asia to enable a coherent regional approach, including monitoring the implementation of UNDRIP at national and local level. For the UN Permanent Forum to explore the potential for the Security Council to address conflict in indigenous territory under the peace and security agenda with the full and effective participation of indigenous women and youth in peace processes. For the UN Permanent Forum to engage with the Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs to have an active role in monitoring the implementation of peace accord involving indigenous people. For the UN agency fund and program to establish a regional interagency working group on indigenous issues in Asia to enable a coherent regional approach, as has been done in Latin America and Africa. For Permanent Forum to explore alternative modality in the conduct of the Permanent Forum section, potentially in different regions following the rotational principle. Ultimately, the full and effective implementation and ongoing rigorous monitoring of UNDRIP is the key to good practices in addressing challenges faced by indigenous people and achieving sustainable peace, justice, and human rights for all. There is no other alternative to this, as it is not only a matter of legal obligation and moral responsibility, but also a necessary foundation for inclusive and equitable society. I thank you.
I thank the member for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of the government of the United Republic of Tanzania, I wish to express our appreciation for the work of the United Nations Panel on the Indigenous Issues and the broader effort of the UN system in promoting human rights, inclusion, and sustainable development. Tanzania upholds the values of dignity, equality, and respect for human rights of all community. Our legal and constitutional framework is rooted in the principles of unity and equal citizenship for all Tanzanians. as it is obligation from the Charter of the United Nations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the other instruments to which Tanzania is a signatory. Tanzania is a unified and democratic nation of more than 120 ethnic groups who identify themselves first and foremost as Tanzanians, united by culture, common heritage, values, and customs, as well as Kiswahili language as their unique identity and symbol of national cohesion. Tanzania legal framework identifies every Tanzanian of African descent as an indigenous person. Therefore, Tanzania does not recognize any specific group as indigenous people. All ethnic communities in Tanzania are considered equal under our law, without classification based on ethnicity, heritage, or tradition or occupation. Our Constitution guarantees the civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights of every Tanzanian. My delegation reiterates Tanzania's firm position following malicious and widespread allegations by few people or groups who have decided to ignore our national laws and values. We regret that this forum sometimes is used to politicize human rights issues. The United Republic of Tanzania is governed by the rule of law, whereby every person is treated equally before the law. Thus, the government is committed to protecting the rights of all its people and ensuring the access to land, education, water, safe environment, healthcare, and economic opportunities. We work to promote inclusive development while respecting Tanzanian diverse cultural heritage. Mr. Chair, the United Republic of Tanzania remains committed to upholding the human rights of all its citizens and working in partnership with the international community. Tanzania believes that the implementation of the International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People must reflect national context, legal frameworks, and the principle of equality among all communities. Let us continue to collaborate in the spirit of respect, objectivity, and mutual understanding to achieve inclusive and sustainable development for all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the member for their intervention, and I now give the floor to the Alliance of Indigenous Women of Central America and Mexico.
Saludos a todas las personas y el
Greetings to everyone and to you, Chair. Thank you for this opportunity as an Alliance of Indigenous Women of Mexico and Central America for giving me this opportunity to be here and to speak about our organization. Indigenous women are agents for change to build peace because this is a path, and we women are that path. We recognize that we are at a historic point in time with historic changes taking place in the world. Things are being reconfigured with a search for global hegemony and what we are seeing are so many different wars, and the battlefield is now really a battle for information based on the new technologies. Humanity has suffered trauma and has become objectified. Either through violent contact, imposition of religion or economic models or manipulation through the media. Therefore, we have to ensure that we know what is ours, what is our territory. Indigenous peoples have our own concepts of peace, our own visions of the world, and we can make a much more benevolent contribution to humanity to ensure that we can care for everyone on the planet and respect the universe that we live in. Restore the life of Mother Earth is necessary for our peoples in terms of our dreams and our offerings to Earth. We need to respect water, air, birds, all forms of plants and indigenous life. We need to create a new narrative of information, recognizing that Mother Earth has her rights. We need to ensure well-being, living well, harmony, balance. We need to restore the memory of reconciliation. We need to clean up our environment. All of this is part of a methodology for peace, guaranteeing inclusion in decision-making processes, free, prior, and informed consent.
Distinguished representative for his statement. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative from the Philippines.
Chair, Indigenous brothers and sisters, Mafian Alaw, good day. The Philippines reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the full and effective implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. The Philippines is proud to say that even before the UNDRIP was adopted in 2007, the Philippines already enacted the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, or the IPRA, in 1997 and became the model for UNDRIP. The IPRA is a landmark national law that affirms our Indigenous peoples' rights to land, governance, justice, cultural integrity, and human rights. The IPRA provides for 4 bundles of rights and 36 sub-rights, which are reflected in the UNDRIP. Through the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, NCIP, we have operationalized these principles in real and practical ways across the country. Primarily, the recognition of Indigenous peoples' customary law, including the concept of native title, has been concretized through the Delineation and Tightening Program. This program affirms the time immemorial concept of Indigenous land ownership through the issuance of Certificates of Ancestral Domain Title, CADT. To date, we have issued 280 CADTs covering more than 6.4 million hectares and benefiting 1.5 million Indigenous peoples' rights holders. Further, confirming Indigenous governance or leadership systems called Indigenous peoples' political structures has been important. These are the organizational and cultural leadership institutions and processes for decision-making and participation of Indigenous peoples. To date, we have established 36 Indigenous people structures. Furthermore, the Philippines continues to work towards ensuring the representation of Indigenous peoples in local legislative councils and policy-making bodies. Currently, there are 5,287 Indigenous peoples mandatory representatives, or IPMRs, including 1,464 Indigenous women serving in local decision-making bodies across the regions of the Philippines. Finally, as we move forward with our commitment to the UNDRIP, let us acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous peoples in the preservation of our Mother Earth for generations yet to come. For this day, who hold our future and who are keepers of our past. Let us continue and sustain this cooperation rooted in our Indigenous identity and heritage. Thank you, Excellencies. Dakan salamat kanilangon.
I thank the distinguished representative for her statement. I now call on the representative from the National Indian Health Board.
Daichilsla, Jen Proctor Andrews Sinsanu, Kokwel Au, Halkaima Mikam Ishtasan, Hania Tlatna, Halkaima Dudlugwa Dakamastan Taltlayasich. Hello, friends and cousins. I'm Vice Chair of the Kokwel Indian Tribe. My name is Jen Proctor Andrews. I'm of the Meekum family, and my ancestral homeland is the place now called Bandon, Oregon. Thank you to Lenape for the care they have put into this land we're on today. In my native language, Milik, the word Manayas means ancestors, creator, and universe. They did not call it traditional ecological knowledge, but the living environment my ancestors meant for us to enjoy was intentionally created and skillfully tended. Since time immemorial, our ancestors practiced sustainable management of fish passages, forest lands, cultural and ceremonial harvests, interacting with the natural world and understanding that it would all be here for us today. However, like many of you here in this room, my ancestors didn't expect to endure challenges of targeted genocidal violence and decades of systemic relocation and assimilation efforts. Forced removal from homelands, detachment from language, food, plants, and waters, and disassociation from our traditional lifeways, which are deeply and intricately connected to the cycles of our environment, continues to this day with lasting impacts on the health of our communities. Despite all of this, du qua du lakak, we're still here. The solution is a return of the resources and rights of self-determination, to live and heal in our communities, the right to live on our land, to dance our dances, to speak our language with access to cultural and modern resources, rights to intellectual property, traditional foods and medicine, connection with each other in the natural world, the space to dream together in harmony with the world that our ancestors meant for us. I asked the Permanent Forum to formulate concrete recommendations for UN member states, UN bodies, and Indigenous peoples to accelerate progress toward implementation of Article 10 of UNDRIP with a focus on land back. I asked the Permanent Forum to include the Indigenous determinants of health as a theme for next year's forum to support our Indigenous communities with mechanisms for revitalization and healing from colonial atrocities, providing a path to culturally safe, systemic change globally, and a framework for identifying indigeneity as an overarching determinant of health, as recommended by the World Health Assembly in 2023. Tsutsi.
I thank the representative from the National Indian Health Board. I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative from Cameroon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my country reiterates its commitment to the work done by the Permanent Forum. And this shown recently in the presentation and the election of Madame Chama as a member of the Permanent Forum. We are convinced that her competence will contribute to the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples and take into account the specificity of each region in the world. Mr. Chair, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples provides a framework for the follow-up and the dignity and the wellness of the indigenous people. My country has benefited from the international definition of the indigenous peoples. This definition would be very useful for the African countries, all of the indigenous people there. It would be decisive for us to identify those people who can be considered as indigenous under international law.
During this session, we'll probably hear from some group from Cameroon labeling themselves as indigenous as the basis of self-identification or on the ground that they are associated back home in indigenous-related activities by the government. This will only be an illustration of the prevailing confusion between indigenous people according to Cameroon Constitution and indigenous people according to the UNDRIP. In Cameroon, each Cameroonian is considered indigenous of their native region. While waiting for the conclusion of the study or the identification of indigenous people, only the groups named Baka, Bakola, Bajeli, and Bajang, commonly called Pygmies, benefit from the national consensus as indigenous people according to UNDRIP. Any other group, no matter their claim here, do not fall under UNDRIP category. This lack of definition of indigenous people is for my country the major challenge for the implementation of UNDRIP. It is a clear and important indication of the divergence in the understanding and identification of indigenous people. This lack of definition is a sign that we need to build an international consensus which takes into account national reality and context. For an active and effective implementation of UNDRIP, Cameroon recommends the development of rigorous criteria on the basis of which indigenous people will be identified and benefit from rights contained in the UNDRIP. Such criteria should not be limited only to self-identification. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative for her statement. I now would like to give the floor to the representative of the Aboriginal Community Elder Services.
Thank you, Chair. Glenn Harrison, Wodjabalek man from Australia. I represent Aboriginal Community Elder Service. I acknowledge and pay my respects to all Indigenous nations and their elders here today. I do address you in respect to the critical issue facing barriers to cultural connection for our older Indigenous Australians and elders across the world, in particular those in need of and receiving aged care services. Challenges faced by Australian Indigenous elders are real, and these challenges prevent elders from realising their rights to accessing cultural participation, providing transgenerational knowledge and healthy ageing. Our Indigenous community suffers from disease at an early age, carries a chronic disease burden that's significantly higher than the rest of the population, and this reflects a norm rather than the exception. Ageing is inevitable, however, healthy ageing is a right. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report shows that our Australian Indigenous population is growing older. Those aged 50 and over has risen or doubled in the last 10 years, and estimates going forwards in the next 30 years will be that our population of 60 to 64 years will increase by 200%, and our population greater than 85 years of age will rise by over 800%. Alarmingly, in metropolitan Australia, only 20% of Indigenous elders living at home participate in cultural activities. This is compared with 60% across all Indigenous age groups. Participation is even less for those in mainstream residential aged care services. These mainstream aged care services are not providing access to or services that enable our elders to participate in culture and community and cultural connection. The right to access and participate in community and cultural activities is stipulated in UNDRIP Article 7. A lack of access and participation prevents intergenerational transfer of cultural knowledge and threatens the continuity of cultural practices as defined in UNDRIP Article 13. Failures of services to provide cultural connection diminishes the social and emotional welfare and healthy ageing. This is a failure of aged care services' duty of care, and this is recognised as inflicting mental anguish and a failure to fulfil caregiving obligations of residential services. These are definitions of elder abuse. Recommendations under Article 13.1, 14.3 and 31. We call on the United Nations and its member states to be accountable to the access and continual participation of our elders in cultural practice. And Article 21, we urge the United Nations to ensure member states develop and resource co-design sustainable programs to allow for cultural programs and participation in cultural activity. Thank you.
I thank the representative for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bavarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente.
Chair, we pass on to you the greetings from our country, from Guaycaway, Puro and Apacuana, and we reaffirm Venezuela's commitment to the defense of indigenous peoples. Chair, our Constitution recognizes and guarantees the inclusion of the more than 44 indigenous peoples that make up our country, as well as the 36 languages, lands, habitats, health, education that make up our country. They're part of our national life. Our current government program provides for the transformation of the Venezuelan state in 7 main areas. They all include indigenous peoples as an integral primal force of this process. And the Ministry for Indigenous Affairs has put forward many initiatives to respect the cultural diversity and spiritual diversity of our countries in a spirit of decolonization, respecting their belief systems and ancestral history, and always in full harmony with nature. Our progress in this area has been destroyed, however, over the last 10 years when a criminal policy was started against our country in the form of so-called sanctions aimed at bringing our country to its knees and destroying our sovereignty and independence. This aggression has had an even more devastating impact on the more vulnerable parts of the nation, including our indigenous peoples, who today, despite their difficulties, are an example of dignity and resistance. We will never tire of insisting, however, for the complete, immediate and unconditional lifting of this cruel blockade against our country. Then, with regard to international affairs, Venezuela maintains active participation in all multilateral fora aimed at discussing the challenges and specific priorities of indigenous peoples. Convinced as we are that the best framework for is consensus, and the best way of achieving political and economic progress is anti-hegemonic multilateralism that is genuinely inclusive and plural. We conclude by confirming Venezuela's determination to continue with these fora for empowerment and resistance in favor of indigenous peoples, secure as we are that victory will be ours. Thank you very much, Chair.
I thank the distinguished member for his statement. Distinguished forum members, distinguished observers, we have exhausted the time allocated to this item, and I thank all speakers for their active participation this afternoon. Participants who were unable to make their interventions due to the lack of time are invited to submit electronic copies of their statement to be posted on the e-statement section of the UN Journal as part of the record of this meeting. The forum will reconvene in this conference room at 10 a.m. tomorrow to begin its consideration of Agenda Item 5G, entitled Thematic Dialogue on the Financing of Indigenous Peoples, Work and Participation Across the Multilateral and Regional System. The meeting is adjourned.